In their only joint television appearance, Bera and Andrew Grant join us on a special episode of Studio Sacramento to talk about the issues that concern you, the voter. California's 7th Congressional District represents eastern Sacramento County and includes the cities of Elk Grove, Folsom, and Rancho Cordova. We begin with both candidates joining me on set, followed by one-on-one conversations.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Congressman Bera, unemployment stands at one of the lowest points in history, 3.7% nationally. But residents in the 7th District still have not completely recovered from the last recession. They're struggling to make ends meet. They find housing increasingly unaffordable. And many are looking for solutions on how to return to the prosperity prior to the crash. And for some, they never experienced prosperity at all. What are your solutions on how to address the issues facing the working and middle class and create greater prosperity for the district?
Great. Scott, I think you're totally accurate here. We see an economic recovery, we see low unemployment rate, but what you're seeing is job creation at the top of the ladder, those that are doing extremely well, and low wage job creation. We're really hollowing out the middle, and that's really where the core of our middle class has to be. One of the reasons why I opposed the Trump tax plan was disproportionately it favored those at the top of the ladder, the biggest corporations, and those that are already doing fairly well. I would suggest that we reform that tax plan to give the bulk of the benefits to middle-class families, to working-class families. I also think we've got to address those young workers coming out of college. They're buried in debt. That is one of the highest places of unemployment. How do you get those individuals back on path? In addition, when we think about our region, our community, there are some areas that are doing fairly well, downtown Sacramento, et cetera, but you look at South Sacramento, Meadowview. One of the areas that we've been working on is creating these opportunity zones there to try to drive investment, drive job creation into some of these low-income census tracts. I think that's a remarkable opportunity for us, not just in the 7th District, but throughout this region.
One follow-up question to you. You say you oppose the Trump tax cuts, but the numbers just came out that the Trump administration's goal of at least starting to hit 4% GDP growth nationally is actually within shouting distance. You don't believe those tax cuts at all have worked?
Well, I don't think those tax cuts have helped those middle-class, working-class folks that are still struggling. Again, we've seen job creation, we see low unemployment, we see a high stock market. That disproportionately is benefiting those that are already doing very well. And a lot of the job creation where you've seen the fastest job growth is low-wage job growth. We've got to actually make that investment in middle-class, working-class families and try to create those middle-class jobs and also give America a pay raise.
All right, thank you. Mr. Grant, your response.
So a couple things that I think are important to understand. Number one, the 7th District and Sacramento County, economy-wise, is always lagging. And so we're actually trailing right now. The 3.7% is nationally, and we have never caught up with the nation. We're 3.9% ourselves. That's only 2%, but there is a difference, and it widens if we hit a recession or difficult times. And so we need to look at this from a purely understanding terms of how many people are employed or who are not employed. The middle class is being employed right now with this lower unemployment rate, period. The fact is that a lot of those middle class people are small business owners. They're getting a 20% tax exemption, pass-through it's called, that allows them to offset some of the costs to keep that small business. District 7 is a community of small businesses. And so I see actually real returns on this. How do you respond to the people who don't see what's happening?
So you're supportive of the tax reform?
Absolutely. And everyone seems to call it the President Trump tax reform bill. it started in Congress. There's been designs on trying to lower the cost and impact and burden on people, especially in California, where we have the highest tax rates in the nation, to help people to soften that cost coming from the federal government. And I think it was actually Congress working with the Trump administration to cut this deal that's important. How do you support that? You perpetuate its efforts in lowering unemployment still and bringing more of the GDP percentage-wise back to District 7. You focus on the bread and butter issues. District 7 is feeling a positive growth response to this. Was it lagging? Were shareholders first receiving money back? Yes. Why? Because confidence wasn't built in that the reform was going to make a difference. It is now. In the last quarterly report, we saw a 0.4% income growth raise. That is a big deal. No one expected that. And so across the board, you're getting income raises, capital investments, confidence, and the businesses who need it are receiving a benefit.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we move on to another big issue, not just for the district, but for California in general. Let's talk a little bit about water. Mr. Grant, what do you consider to be the biggest challenges confronting not just the district, but the region related to water, and what are your plans should you be elected to address them?
Well, the biggest challenge is scarcity of clean, available water, period, across the state. And there are places that have severe needs not being met. And at the same time, every time there's a decision made to decide on where we increase storage, we don't go to the easiest locations to do that. Shasta is available right now. In fact, there's been some federal funding to support increasing storage capacity at Shasta. I keep hearing about sites and Temperance and these reservoirs locations. First of all, they're very expensive to build. The evaporation rates for those two locations are very costly in terms of how much water and output you'd actually receive. And I drove up to sites and spoke to farmers who would receive water from sites in particular. And in that case, the cost of water will be 6 times what they're using right now coming from the Sacramento River. Why don't we focus on the easy work first to increase storage capacity, which includes Shasta and other places where we can increase that and provide more available water.
So you're supportive of increasing storage capacity. You have a perspective on some of, kind of the goblins that have been talked about for decades around here, like the Auburn Dam?
Yeah, well, I have been talked to several times about the Auburn Dam. A lot of people think that's the most feasible blueprint-wise opportunity for new storage capacity. But let's do the small things first. While we're talking about water, by the way, I absolutely disagree with the Delta Tunnel project. Not only does it damage the environment around the Delta, but farmers and others who rely on that water availability are going to lose. And that includes us. People don't understand that SMUD actually took action against the Delta Tunnel project. Why? Because our SMUD rate is going to increase if they don't have access to the hydropower and they rely on Sacramento River to use hydropower. And so, there's a lot bottled into this Delta Tunnel grab that's being attempted by Lower California.
And from your vantage point, Congressman Bera?
I'd agree with Andrew that we've been fighting the Delta Tunnel and we've successfully been holding that off, and that's been pretty bipartisan because it doesn't actually create additional water. I would take an all of the above approach because what we know is climate change is changing water utilization in California. Our aqueduct system and reservoir systems built on having a robust snowpack up in the Sierra Nevadas and having a slow snow melt. We know more of that precipitation is coming down as water. So we do have to increase storage capacity. We've done that through the joint federal project at Folsom Dam, primarily a flood control project, but it does actually increase our storage capacity for Folsom Lake. The reason why I actually support the Sites Reservoir project, and both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, along with Governor Brown, think that is the quickest thing that we could actually do and the most feasible effort. We're already allocating funding to get that project going. That'll take pressure off of Folsom Lake, and hundreds of thousands of folks in the Sacramento region, 7th District, that's their drinking water supply. We remember a few years ago when we were in the drought and how low Folsom Lake was. We've also got, we're supporting groundwater recharge. That's a huge reservoir as well. So what we've got to do is, if it's not coming down as snow, it's coming down as rain. Instead of letting that just run out to the ocean, how do we actually capture, store that rain, and then have it when we need it in the summertime?
Same question to you. again, it's been talked about for decades, lots of people on different sides of the issue. What say you about the proposed Auburn Dam that's comes back and forth every once in a while?
I wouldn't support the Auburn Dam.
Why not?
It sits on an earthquake fault line, and it puts us at risk.
Okay, all right. Congressman Bera, what steps, if any, should be taken to curb gun violence in our communities? And up to and including, is there something that needs to be addressed with the Second Amendment as it stands today?
You know, so the first thing is I would look at gun violence as a public health emergency. You know, I think all of us are tired of seeing these tragedies in schools, movie theaters, et cetera. Let the CDC actually treat it as a public health issue, study, collect the data, find out actually what the root cause issues are. I am proud to be a Californian because we've allocated $5 million to start that here in California, so we have a better understanding of what's causing this, so we also know what interventions we should do. I also think you know, both sides go to this is about taking your guns away or not taking your guns away. I think we're missing the issue here. This is about keeping our communities safe and reducing violence. Most of the public supports background checks. You know, that's not about taking your guns away. It's about keeping guns out of the hands of folks that are suicidal, homicidal. That's a good starting point. You know, I personally don't think you need military-style weapons out there, assault weapons. You know, will that curb the violence? I don't know, but you know, again, in California, I do think we've passed certain progressive laws. I also think if I, as a doctor, am seeing someone who I think is suicidal or homicidal and they've got a gun in the house, I should have the ability to contact law enforcement and they should be able to go intervene and temporarily remove that gun. Now that person's due process rights aren't going to be impinged on because they can still say, no, I'm not suicidal or homicidal and get that gun back. But you know, teachers and others sometimes see these things.
All right. Mr. Grant?
So there's a lot to do with this issue, of course. Anyone who watched what happened in Florida, in Colorado and other places is shocked and understands this as a tragedy completely. Is it a social tragedy? Of course, it's a personal tragedy by the people who were harmed or those who lost someone in Florida. But the fact is, if you go around and you tell people that we're going to take your guns or we're going to control your gun in a certain manner, that is the one thing for a lot of places, even in District 7, in many places in District 7, and I've walked that ground and I've spoken to those people and I've asked them a question directly at their door. What do you think about gun control? They say the only thing that protects me is the gun that I own. It protects my family, it protects my property. And that's my feelings, and that's a strong feeling that's out there. And so when I look at that and go, okay, these people have guns to protect themselves as public persons, as a family, as a property owner. What do we do now? What's the Second Amendment mean to them? It means a lot to them. Does it mean that we can't continue to staff the resource officers and others to protect, especially our schools? No question. Does it mean the gun violence restraining orders that have been used modestly in California could be expanded for due process? Completely. I think that's absolutely true. But when it comes right down to it, every time we decide that, especially rifles, which are most often not part of gun-related crime, every time we decide we're going to control a gun, A, gun sales spike incredibly. B, the people who safely and properly own guns feel like they're losing the defense of the family, of their property, and we just can't go that direction.
Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up. I think we've got to reframe the conversation, though. It's not about taking your gun away. It's about keeping our community safe. And the vast majority of gun owners are not committing crimes. They're not doing anything other than protecting themselves or going out hunting, et cetera. But we always fall into this conversation of taking your guns away or not taking your guns away. And I think we're missing the point. I think everyone could agree on how do we keep our community safe. I don't want to arm teachers.
What does that mean, though?
Well, you know, when you talk about arming schools and teachers, that's absolutely going in the wrong direction. Our schools should be the absolute safest places where our kids are.
So you disagree with arming schools?
Oh, absolutely.
How do you feel about that, Mr. Grant?
I don't think we should arm teachers. I think teachers should teach. But do I think we need to protect the students and the teachers from anyone who might come in and attempt a gun-related crime against them? Absolutely. I don't understand how you would not want to do that. Look, we already have ordinance in places right now. Well, first of all, the 5 largest cities in the United States, we have just a slew of ordinance and codes around gun control, severe gun control. And those are the same places where gun-related crime continues to rise.
Which cities
we have the
are you
same
referring
thing,
to?
Well, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, big cities, okay? But they've been places where there's been a lot of gun-related crime, and a response has been, oh, let's slap more ordinance on it. Control, control, control. And it hasn't done anything. Let's go back to schools. Each of our schools has a gun-free zone around it right now, where there are severe penalties for going in and even having a gun with your person. And yet, what is happening? So the fact that we would basically accept and try to reshift the conversation, we have to focus on making sure students and teachers are protected while they're there, the reality of what's out there. The San Bernardino event, where it was terrorists who were actually, one was an American citizen and his wife, if you recall, okay? The SWAT team was driving around because they were running a separate operation, and they were fully armed, fully loaded, full prepared to deal with anything, a SWAT level operation. It took them 6 minutes to get there. And so that is, to a lot of people in their minds, that is not enough of a solution. They're going to protect themselves, they're going to protect their kids.
So how far would you go in terms of arming personnel at schools?
The SRO program is a great program. Go talk to law enforcement about this, part-time sheriffs, people in our own community. The organizations I've spoken to completely support this, and there is nothing wrong with sending federal dollars to make sure that they are properly prepared to deal with the issue.
And would you agree with arming school personnel as well?
Look, I think that's the wrong direction. Think about it when we were growing up and going to schools. We didn't, you might get in a fist fight or something, but you didn't worry about being unsafe. I think we're missing the point because we're not collecting the data. A lot of these shooters, it wasn't as though a teacher didn't know that something was going on, or a parent didn't know, or a friend didn't see something. Let's try to understand, are there some common elements in these individuals? Because these are not the gun owners that we're talking about. These are folks that consciously made a decision to go out and create mass violence.
How do you do that, though?
Well, so again, I'm looking at this as a doctor and a public health expert. You collect the data, you look for commonalities, and then you figure out, okay, what interventions might actually prevent these tragedies. And you might find that it isn't additional gun laws. You might find that it is providing more mental health. It's providing the resources for that teacher or that parent to say,
that sounds a lot like some of the positions that the NRA has put forward in terms of increasing mental health interventions. Is that really a complete solution, though?
Look, some of these folks had mental health issues and had no place to go get those services.
All right.
So I don't disagree. Just because it's coming from the NRA, I'm not going to disagree with it. If there's a mentally unstable person who's suicidal or homicidal, absolutely, we got to get them help.
Incidentally, do you consider the NRA a constructive or destructive force in trying to come to some resolution on the gun violence situation in this country?
I mean, I think they've been destructive in changing the politics.
Thank you. Mr. Grant, constructive or destructive, the NRA?
I'm pretty impartial to the NRA. I think in terms of gun ownership, they've provided a lot of training for gun safety, gun responsibility. I've never been a member of the NRA. I don't have a strong affiliation with them. I don't have support from them.
So you don't really have an opinion on them?
So yeah, look, if you own a gun, you're responsible to own that gun safely, period. It doesn't matter if you're part of the NRA or not. So in my view, if they can reinforce the proper owning of guns in a safe way, then I would support their causes. When they don't, I disagree.
The purpose for the question, though, is assuming that you go to Congress in the spring, they're a force in this conversation. How is it, if you don't have an opinion on them, how are you going to engage them? Not that I don't have an
opinion on them, Scott. It's that I look at what their position is, their messaging is, their issues are, how they share their concerns, what positions they take, and I say, is it right for District 7? If they don't support gun violence restraining orders, for example, then I think they're wrong. I actually think that is a very unused avenue. It's due process. Look, there are women, mostly, I would argue, who are in domestic violence situations and their husband's a gun owner. And that's real concern. I'm sure it works the other way as well, but I would say predominantly not so. And they should have a means to protect themselves from someone that is in their own family who owns a gun. And I think GVROs are a good way to do that.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the state of the nation for a second. Congressman Bera, take off your congressman's hat.
Okay.
And just as a citizen, do you believe that the rise of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the Parkland students' activity, and the white identitarian movements, what do you think that those communicate about the state of America at this moment?
Scott, I think they touch on some of the tensions that exist in America, not just across the country, but also within communities. I mean, we can look at communities that are doing well, but communities that feel like they're falling behind. And I think it's too simplistic to say, well, Donald Trump created these divisions in America. They existed before President Trump. He may have exacerbated these, and at a minimum, he's brought them to the forefront, whether it's racial matters, whether it's sexism, misogyny, et cetera. They're out there. Shame on us if we don't, as a country, have an honest dialogue about these divisions. You know, when I think about what's happening in America right now, we are segregating geographically. You know, I fly home to Sacramento, and our economy's doing fairly well. You've touched on, we've got issues and challenges like affordable housing, homelessness, et cetera, but we don't feel overwhelmed. But when I talk to my colleagues who represent small town Kentucky or rural Ohio, they see something totally different. And they're doing their jobs representing their constituents. But we've created these two different Americas, and you'll see it in the lower income communities, inner city, versus more affluent downtowns and suburbs. Unless we find the courage to honestly state, you know, what's going on in America and the divisions, and that there are these differences, we won't find the solutions and we won't come together. And I think that is the ultimate challenge right now.
Mr. Grant, how do you see these movements and what they mean?
Sure, 2 points. First of all, Ami, they are feeling it. We are struggling in District 7. The same struggles that are in Kentucky and other places, it's out there. There are places in District 7 that I would say, and I visited Kentucky too. I've been to Georgia, I've been to Alabama, I've been to places where people define that. It's here in District 7 as well, especially in California. The cost of living and dealing with the issues that are being thrown at us from the state level, one of your first responsibilities should be to protect against those things. The climate, we've got it covered. It's California. The income tax, it's the highest in the nation. We're not doing anything for District 7 because we're not recognizing that Kentucky is here in our community as well.
But get
It's
that.
true.
But
well, let's
Mr.
talk about your question. So, absolutely, these groups should share their concerns in these areas. There should be nothing to stop them from promoting and helping people to understand that there is a reality that's different in other places. Black Lives Matter, what are they saying? What they're trying to say is that, you know what, for too long, the lives of the black community have not been understood, recognized, and supported like other places in the United States. And that should be the strong message. Where they tip into becoming violent or attacking others because they don't agree with their positions, I find that wrong, of course. The same with these other groups. The one group I would call out who don't deserve any justice at this point is the white supremacist groups who have risen, probably because they're looking to align themselves with the Trump administration in some way, despite him pushing back and saying there is no relationship. But they're taking advantage of the situation. And what they're doing is criminal acts, no question.
incidentally, you had a little taste of that yourself recently.
Yeah,
when you went out
surprisingly.
to Folsom
Right.
and you visited an Islamic center.
Yep.
What did that experience? Give us a brief on what that experience was
actually
and what happened.
Glad you brought that up. Those were two friends of mine who I had established a relationship with before I went to their festival. I was going for a walk in Folsom for the campaign. I came back, I saw that they had an activity. I went over to say hello and knew them before and took a simple picture. This wasn't an attempt to sort of pose with them or push a certain message. This was just connecting with two people who live in Folsom. One of them has lived
And
in
what
Folsom
happened?
for 28 years.
What happened?
There was a very negative reaction initially on Facebook when I posted the message. People saying, claiming that I was Muslim, which I'm not, but it wouldn't be wrong if I was. claiming that that I support ISIS and terrorist organizations. Down with me. There was a lot of comments, and then, but overwhelmingly, the pushback against them was, you're missing completely. We are a diverse nation. We are an accepting nation. These two people, who, by the way, like I mentioned, were citizens of Folsom far longer than me, we should accept them within our community. So I felt like by a order of 10 or 20 or even 30 to 1, the right message came out through doing that.
Right. Congressman, I just wanted to find out, in your
Well,
travels...
there's a lot there.
Yeah, in your travels, and you talk about what's going on in the other parts of the country, but in our district, in the 7th District, what do those sorts of issues, have they become more prevalent in recent years?
Certainly, there's challenges that we see in the 7th Congressional District. When I talk to our mayors, our city council, and folks just out there in the community, homelessness is now either the first or second issue that comes up. And that's not just a downtown Sacramento
But I'm talking
issue
about
now.
this movement issue.
You see it. It's a little bit more in South Sacramento, and in terms of Black Lives Matter. Certainly sexual harassment is prevalent, and making sure everyone has opportunity. But in truth, I think the 7th Congressional District is a remarkable place in the diversity that it has, in the economic opportunity that presents. And if we're smart and strategic, you're seeing that vibrancy in Rancho Cordova. You're seeing Elk Grove not just being a great place to live and raise a family, but now they're pulling the jobs down there. And we are coming up with that strategic plan about how to make not just the 7th District, but the Sacramento region the center of it all. I did want to touch on, it's unfortunate that you experienced some of that racism and racist rhetoric. And I've been out to that Muslim center previously as well. You see this in this region, and it is unacceptable. What concerns me, and when people ask me about how I feel about President Trump, it is his character and racist rhetoric that allows that to come out of the shadows. Now, again, it's been here in our community, and it's unfortunate that you have to feel it, but there are folks that feel that every day.
Mr. Graham, what do you think is the most important political issue confronting our nation today? And what specific action or legislation, should you be elected, will you champion to address it in the next Congress?
So when you are a member of Congress, you have to reflect what you're going to do for your community, District 7, and then what you're going to do for your state, really, and then for your country. And by far, everyone I speak to in District 7, except for those who are either very successful or in government often, are concerned about the next recession. So to dismiss that issue, to me, is a real miss.
So that is the biggest issue?
That is the issue that comes up all the time. The other ones that trail that would be healthcare, immigration.
Just one.
The environment.
So what is it that specifically you would do, you would lead programmatically and legislatively to address
focusing on the top two, the number one issue and the top two ways to do that is to continue to focus on tax reform so that we're not burdening people, especially in California, even more. The second one is to enable businesses to grow and thrive and be entrepreneurial, the things we want from business, and that is to reduce the regulation costs and the time involved in dealing with regulation coming from the federal government.
It's interesting you mentioned regulation.
Yep.
What would be your test in terms of what is a burdensome regulation and what is one that either creates a level playing field
Right.
or ultimately protects the public interest?
Well, I think you have to manage regulation, not just provide these very open-ended laws and then allow the Washington bureaucrats to decide what that regulation looks like. I think there has to be much more defined and scripted, I call it small legislation. When you make these omnibuses, these compromises, for example, there's been a lot of conversation around comprehensive immigration reform, which I don't think is the right direction.
Right, but
we
let's
find we're losing
stick
ends
to
here.
your issue.
My point being, what's the return on investment? Who's gaining as a result of this regulation? Who's losing as a result of this regulation? And by the way, when we set regulation in place, we should sunset to ask ourselves, if we're in Congress, whether we remove that regulation.
The one question though that pops into my head though, Mr. Grant, is we were just discussing at the top of this discussion that the economy, in some people's estimation, at least superficially for the most affluent among us, is doing fantastically well. You're saying that as you go throughout the district that the recession is the #1 issue, and that's going to be the #1 issue that you address in Congress. But right now, we're doing well. And what I'm trying to get to is there a particular piece of legislation or initiative beyond just general rollbacks on regulation that you want to champion because you think that it'll have a transformative effect on the issue of protecting us from a recession or helping us climb out of it, either for both the 7th District but for the nation at large?
Yeah, so the next big move related to exactly what you just described is infrastructure. It is getting through Congress a national infrastructure bill that enables us to not only repair, maintain, but in the proper way grow the facilities and the operations and the overall ecosystem to help us weather through the difficult times, which we don't have right now as much. But while we're doing so well, let's get that bill passed and let's do some things that enable us in the most difficult times.
All right. Congressman Bera, what would be the single biggest issue you think is confronting the country that you want to address in the next Congress?
There's a number of issues, but I'll stick to one. And I see this as one of the core reasons why I first ran for office. As a doctor, healthcare is essential, and that is of concern to a lot of folks in our community. We've got to not just address access to care, but we've got to address costs. That's a bigger issue, and it's an increasing issue. We've got a bill ready to go that we actually introduced this last Congress, bipartisan, that would help stabilize the markets and bring costs down. That instability in insurance markets is driving up premiums 10, 20, 30%. That would be the first thing that I would do. The second piece that I would do is actually, you've got to get everyone into the system. I mean, in a country like ours, if you get sick, you ought to be able to go see a doctor.
Do you support Bernie Sanders' Medicare for all?
I don't. So.
Why not? Why not?
Because, if we were starting from scratch, we might be doing something different. But you're not going to go to 85% of Americans that actually like the health care they have and say, we're going to take that away from you. But we've got to get everyone into the system, because if you have a robust marketplace and a risk pool, you actually will bring down costs. And then third, give people choice. They know best the type of care that they need for themselves and their families. And one of those could be allowing them to buy into Medicare if that's what they want to do. But again, I don't think it's right to take, if you like the health care that you have, great, go ahead and keep, select that.
But it is a commonly accepted reality that President Obama said that everyone could keep the health care that they had, and that really wasn't accurate.
Well, so what I said is give people choice, and then that's up to you to say, look, I like the health care my employer is giving me. I'm going to go ahead and keep that. But you know what? There's an option to buy into Medicare. I'm 55 years old. That could be one solution. Another solution could be, if you're relatively healthy, et cetera, looking at the type of health care that you need. I think what we have to do when we're looking at that, we've got to make those options affordable. And we're not addressing that. Pharmaceutical costs go through the roof right now. Hospital costs are going through the roof. We've got to start moving away from treating on the back end and actually starting to get people the preventive care that they need.
We'll stay with this for a second. Mr. Grant, on health care, what's your prescription to get to a more, I'll say, safe and sane health care system?
Well, a couple things that that my opponent said that I agree with. Number one, we need to focus on the care, the quality of care. I've heard you in previous times talk about the doctor-patient relationship. That has to be the defining relationship when you're dealing with the quality of care. And then there's this separate conversation around insurance and cost and providership in terms of what you can afford and choices you have. What's happening right now, though, the reality on the street, the more and more money we take from government to offset costs within the insurance industry for the care that's received, the more and more, or the less and less, I would argue, there's transparency and understanding, and there's a rising of cost. Why? Because these companies know that they can use the government to be subsidized to fulfill their work. And there's more investments coming from all over the place to increase the load and cost as well. But if you can't see it on your bill and have choice and be able to understand who's paying for what, or if you're in a position to where you don't have to have any skin in the game and not pay anything for health care you're receiving, then what's happening? You're not caring, and the cost is increasing.
Look,
so there has to be a reduction overall in the use of government money. Now, when you talk about getting everyone in the system, what you're effectively saying is forcing everyone to pay money for possibly the care that they choose to not have if they don't want to. And so what I say is break that down to allow people in the market to decide on what options of health care they want, the insurance they want, and as their lives change, maybe they change their doctor and change their healthcare situation and get different insurance and whatnot, using the market.
So if I were just I agree with Andrew that transparency has to be in there, and I'll give applause to the Trump administration for this week passing a rule saying that pharmaceutical companies that are advertising on television have to put the price of those medications on there. That's a good thing, inform the consumer. What I would say about getting everyone into the system, here's the reality. If you're uninsured and you have a heart attack and you show up in my emergency room, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to nurse you back to health. But that cost
And somebody else is going to have to pay.
Everyone else who has insurance is going to have to pay. So at a minimum, let's get folks into the system with at least some essential coverage. Now, if they choose to opt out, they can choose to opt out. We've got a bill that we've worked on with Republicans and others to do auto enrollment. So the default is we'd like you to have health insurance coverage, at least basic health insurance coverage. If you don't want it, great, you can opt out. This is about individual choice and individual freedoms. But once they're in the system, give them that menu and let them choose what kind of coverage they'd want.
Incidentally, big conversation that's going on nationally right now is on pre-existing conditions. Protect people with pre-existing?
Absolutely.
Protect?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
But that means don't repeal the Affordable Care Act, because that, when you repeal the Affordable Care Act, you are taking away those protections.
Let's move on to trade. Congressman, how do you view President Trump's actions on trade policy and imposing tariffs on our allies in North America as well as Europe and China? And what do you think the impact of America's new posture on trade is going to have on the long-term prosperity to the country?
So it's causing a lot of anxiety. Certainly here in California, agriculture is a major part of our economy, and in the 7th District. These trade wars, we have specialty crops, we have crops that have tried to get market access or have gained market access. Now they're watching their access in China and India and other places decrease. I'm glad that the president was able to work something out with a renegotiated NAFTA.
But how do you feel about his posture and how he's engaging?
Well, it's not the way I would do it. I think he takes this very threatening position. If it works, if it gets us better deals, great. I wish he'd work with Congress and that we'd actually all be coordinating together. It remains to be seen as we analyze this NAFTA deal if it gets us to a better place. But I don't, again, I think threatening trade wars is what potentially leads us into that recession.
Thank you. Mr. Grant, you're the former head of the Northern California World Trade Center. How do you view the posture that President Trump and the administration is taking on trade?
I have some mixed feelings about certain elements of how they're posturing, but boy, I got to tell you, I like the fact that there's someone going into the world and saying, we're representing America. And I think a lot of the messaging that he's giving when he does that is exactly his role to do that. He was elected by the people of the United States to represent them in the world, and he's doing a good job on that. Do I think the tweets and some of the other statements he makes, the backslapping that I see and I observe, do I think that's proper or right all the time? No. But I think you and I would both agree that our concern around what's happening, especially with China, and the very deliberate nature in which they're attempting to threaten us economically and in some cases militarily, is a real concern. And it's going to take someone very strong to deal with not only the headwinds coming from China, but the entire international system. How many years did we have in the World Trade Organization arbitration clauses against China and we didn't do anything about it? We had steel coming into Mexico, using NAFTA to be sold into the United States, and it originally came from China. So how many of those situations do we decide finally enough is enough and go after what China is doing to us?
Incidentally, some would say that the world has flipped itself upside down because historically, the types of actions that President Trump's taken, wouldn't they be considered more on the progressive side of the equation, Congressman Bera, than typical what you'd consider Chamber of Commerce policy?
Yeah, I think there's a recasting of where the political parties are. I do think President Trump's given us an opportunity to have a different conversation about trade.
All right. Mr. Grant, any final thoughts on this subject?
Look, you go to District 7, you ask what's important to you. Jobs and the economy. Not right now because things are going well, but for the future when we're most challenged. And a guy is going out there and representing us to do things in support of that opportunity.
And we're going to have to...
I see that as good.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a rich and substantive conversation. Coming up next, one-on-one conversations with the candidates. Up first, Andrew Grant. Welcome back, Mr. Grant.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about foreign policy. With your background and experience in the military and intelligence, we've got a lot of firefights going on or kind of Cold Wars, right? Quasi-Cold Wars going on throughout the world. Do you think that the U.S. should continue to act as the world's policeman and continue to support our activities through massive foreign aid? Or should we be more focused today on focusing on our internal affairs and leave military intervention and development issues to other nations?
We can't sort of remove ourselves from the world. I know that. We've done that in the past. We've attempted to do that in the past, and it's come back to bite us. And so we have to certainly stay to a level involved. What I think the administration's trying to do, which in Congress I would support, is ensure that our partners, our allies, those that expect a lot from us, are also giving into those commitments as well. I'm someone that is supportive of supporting democracies and allies and neighbors who are trying to reform in ways that support us and our interests. But every time we make a decision where we send money overseas, every time we make a decision where we send our military or diplomacy corps overseas, we are taking away from what could be opportunities to help Americans. And I think a high level of scrutiny is important for those decisions. Recent conversation I had was about Afghanistan versus Iraq and our decision to go post 9/11 into Afghanistan. I was there 2 months after Afghanistan, after 9/11, I was in Afghanistan, and I knew I was in the right place. Was I sure that we should have taken the action in Iraq? Now that I know in history what we knew to be false allegations around Saddam's efforts to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction.
The yellow cake and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, how far along was he? And how easy for those very difficult situations to make calls were there? I'm not going to go back and place judgment on every single person who said we should have or shouldn't, but a high level of scrutiny is necessary. One of the things I'll tell you, Scott, that I'm concerned about is Congress continues to punt these issues almost always over to the executive branch.
Let me ask you a little bit about that. One theory that I've heard, I haven't heard that often, but I have heard it in conjunction with the fact that it used to be that you had a number of men and women who had served, who were in Congress, and so there was more of a direct skin in the game and being involved in the decision-making process on these issues. Do you feel right now that there is enough, or does it concern you at all that there's enough representation of people who've actually served that are help guiding these decisions at the federal level?
Oh, we're at our lowest level in 50 years for members of Congress who have served in our military. And we're making decisions to send our young men and women overseas into places to possibly die for our country. And yet we're at that level of experience in Congress. We lost a lot with John McCain for that very reason. John McCain would make statements to this president, to previous presidents, where he'd say, if you don't develop a strategy for Syria or for Afghanistan, we're going to push a strategy on you. That assertiveness for what we're doing with our men and women going into harm's way is lost right now on Capitol Hill, and we need to regain it.
Let's talk about two of those hot spots most in the news, North Korea and Iran.
Yep.
Which do you consider the bigger threat? And are we doing all that we need to do on both of those issues?
Iran I see as the bigger threat.
Really?
Yes.
How so?
They are a more capable nation to do us harm immediately.
You did not support President Obama's nuclear
No, I did not.
agreement. And the reason for that was?
The reason for that is because it leaves us blind to what's going on in the military sites in Iran, which
How
is,
so?
it's not part of the agreement. So there are specific military facilities that in the agreement cannot be inspected by the regime in place. At the same time, it's a 30-day arbitration process, which is to say we've seen something and we can do something 30 days later. Those two reasons alone, combined with the repatriation of $61 billion, which was, we know, directly used back in attacks against U.S. soldiers in Iraq, it's not something I can support. The easiest way, institutionally, we could have solved this would have been for the Obama administration to ask the Senate to ratify it, for them to disagree, which they did, to go back and renegotiate an agreement with the Western European countries and us and Iran and fix it to a point where they would have ratified the agreement.
Let's go back to something that we talked about in
Okay.
an earlier conversation, talking about trade. With your background as the former head of the Northern California World Trade Center, what specifically should we be evaluating as we consider how we move forward with trade with China? Right now, because...
Yeah. The China rising middle class is an incredibly potential market for us to sell into. 95% of our consumers are outside the United States for who we should sell to in terms of market. And a large portion of that is that rising middle class. We have to push China to give us the same access that we have given them to our strength in consumer markets, to that rising middle class in China. What they have done is they have specifically designed their efforts against us and others to oppose access to that market.
Right. Incidentally, just final thoughts. How has this campaign been experienced by your family? Just very quickly.
My wife is completely on board with what I'm doing. She understands the reasons, the deep reasons why. At one point in my time, she said, Andrew, for you to do this would be not to do what you've always done, which is serve. And so my wife is completely on board. It's been tough just in terms of the legwork. What I always say with my family is that I've made this choice. They support me. And whatever I can do to soften the difficulty of being out there and away from them all the time, I'll do. And so, yeah, it's also been an experience. It's been something they've learned from as well, and that's important.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Grant. Coming up next, a one-on-one conversation with Ami Bera. Welcome back, Mr. Bera.
Glad to be back.
How do you judge America's historic role as the world's policeman and provider of foreign aid in an era where those missions are being challenged?
Well, so I think President Trump touched on some things and asked some of the right questions that a lot of us feel. We can't fight every war around the world. We can't go defend every nation. And our foreign policy approach in the last 70 years, post-World War II, probably was the right foreign policy. Rebuilding Europe, helping Japan rebuild, defending democracy on the Korean Peninsula. We've created these stable democracies. The next 70 years may be different. Where I disagree with the president is withdrawing from the world, because I think the world is a better place with American leadership when we lead with our values of freedom, free markets, democracy, You do see the rise of autocratic leaders around the world, and some would say, even in our own country, you're seeing autocracy. That isn't our values of democracy. And now I think the next 7 years is partnering with our allies, partnering with friends like Japan, South Korea, our European allies, not making them enemies. They're not our enemies, they're our friends, and then going into third countries. But it'll be a slightly different world order where we're partnering and still leading the way.
Two of the big flashpoints in the world right now are North Korea and Iran, particularly from a U.S. perspective. Which do you consider to be the bigger threat and challenge?
Had you asked me a year ago, and over the past year and a half, I've made several trips to Korea to meet with President Moon, with their foreign minister, meet with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, because a year ago I would have said, we're not that far away from war, and I don't think the president's rhetoric is helping us. I do think we're further away from war today than we were a year ago on the Korean Peninsula.
Do you give President Trump credit for that?
Yeah, I've said all along that I think it's the right move to sit down and have dialogue. You don't have to like the person across the table from you, but you have to be willing to talk. And there are two paths forward: finding a diplomatic solution to reducing tensions on the peninsula and ultimately getting to denuclearization, versus going to war. And no one wants a kinetic conflict there. I think the bigger challenge today, we talked about Iran, but more broadly, what's going on in the Middle East. That's Yemen, that's Syria, that's a rise of Hezbollah and Hamas, and you're seeing the Sunni states lining up on one side and the Shia states lining up on the other. And the last thing we need right now is a true civil war in the Middle East, and some would argue that that's happening. There is an urgency of solving the Syrian challenge. I was in Jordan last summer. They've absorbed 1.5 million refugees. And when you go to those refugee camps and talk to them, they can't stay there forever because it's creating massive tension and stress on Jordan, one of our strongest allies. If Jordan goes under, that war is on the border of Israel now. And again, there's an urgency of solving Syria so those refugees eventually can return home.
Foreign policy used to be an area where Democrats and Republicans say that difference ends at the water's edge and we're united. You are a leader in what's called the Problem Solvers Caucus. What grade would you give that organization in your attempts to try and build some bipartisan solutions over the term of this last Congress?
I'm the one of the co-founders of the Problem Solvers Caucus and the past Democratic chair of that caucus. It's 48 of us, 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans, that are trying to make a difference. It's the only bipartisan caucus. Where we're focused on right now is we don't know who will be in the majority in the House. What we do know is there will be a new speaker. And whoever that speaker is has to be a speaker of the whole House, not just a speaker to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
Is that really realistic, though? Once people get in power, it almost seems like the George Orwell book Animal Farm, where you complain about the oppressor until you get it to the job, and then you become every bit the same animal.
Well, we've got to change something, right? I mean, you've had periods in our history where no one would say Speaker Tip O'Neill was not a strong speaker, but the true power lied with the committee chairman. You had these strong chairs, and that's where the real bipartisan work has to happen. On foreign policy, where you have Ed Royce working with Elliot Engel and all of us working together. And then if we come up with legislation, it's got to come to the floor. In today's Congress, the power lies with, whether it's Nancy Pelosi on one side, Paul Ryan on the other side, or Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer. And it's a top-down approach. What we're going to try to do as the problem solvers is make it a bottom-up, give the power back to the members in the committee.
From your colleagues, you're part of this caucus. Just very quickly, what working member of the opposing party in Congress do you admire most, and why?
There's a lot of folks, and I would say
just one.
I think there's folks like Jeff Denham that I work closely with. There's folks, like, and this is going to sound strange. I've done legislation with Mark Meadows, who's a co-founder of the Freedom Caucus.
Mark Meadows?
Yeah. Look, I'm a physician, and he serves rural North Carolina. They've got rural healthcare shortages there. We came up with a bill to try to solve that issue.
What has been your family's experience in being a part of this campaign in a year like 2018?
You know, I don't think anyone expected President Trump to win that election. I don't know that he expected it. It's been a tumultuous year, but I think they also recognize, and we have faith in this country, that he didn't cause the divisions in America. He's exposed to these ruptures and fissures. Now let's find the courage to actually address them. And Janine and I work closely together to try to address these issues. And it's the same thing as being a doctor. How do you serve? How do you help people make their lives better? In this case, how do we help make our country better?
All right. Well, thank you, Congressman.
You're welcome. Thank you, Scott.
And that's our show. Thanks to our guests and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. Remember, your vote counts. I'm Scott Syfax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org.